All right, so to start off, we are going to be doing an ed puzzle on plant reproduction. Make sure that, first of all, you have already done your attendance form and your contact tracing, if you are in person. You're going to be doing this ed puzzle next on plant reproduction and plant reproductive structures. And then you're going to work on your interactive notebook section. And lastly, your exit ticket. This exit ticket has a couple more points than you're used to, so make sure you're reading carefully so you can earn all the points you deserve by the time it's graded. So first off, I want you to answer some pretty easy questions. First of all, what is your favorite fruit? And second one, are you allergic to pollen? The reason I'm asking is because fruits and pollen are both part of the reproductive structures of plants. Now, this is going to be kind of weird to explain it this way, but the fruit is basically an ovary, and the pollen is basically sperm. So if you've eaten fruits, you've eaten ovaries of plants. And if you are allergic to pollen, you're literally allergic to packages of sperm of plants, which is kind of funny to think about. Our learning objective is that learners will be able to identify the plant structures used for reproduction and explain their purposes by completing this ed puzzle and a section of their interactive notebook based on what week you're in. So first off, plant reproduction. Plants can reproduce sexually or asexually, and some of them actually alternate years of which one they do, or it's based on the resources that are available. So if they have a lot of resources, they're going to reproduce sexually because that takes up a lot more energy from the plants. And if there's not a lot of resources, some can alternate to do asexual reproduction because they just have to split their own cells in half and then just make them into spores and just go. Sexual reproductive parts produce seeds, right? And the seeds are usually coming from flower buds that turn into flowers and then turn into fruit. And the fruit is the protection part of the seed, right? The seed is like the egg instead of an ovary, and then the fruit is the ripened ovary that has like a nice protective shell to the actual baby of the plant, which is the seed. That's important to know just because fruits can sometimes be really fleshy, like for example, like apples and watermelon, but they can also be more for protection. So like the shell of like nuts or I guess like coconut's still technically a nut, but like protective hard shells on the outside. So the flower. Sexual reproduction is the sole function of the flower. The flower is not created for anything else, not asexual reproduction, only sexual reproduction. So the colorfulness and the smell of flowers is only to attract pollinators. So this way that plants can get their pollen picked up from one flower and then dropped off at another flower as they're kind of feeding the pollinator nectar for free, to kind of make it a mutualistic relationship where they both benefit, right? I get to take my pollen and put it onto another flower to produce babies, and you get free nectar, which has sugar and has energy. So pollinators can be insects, they can be birds, right? We all know about bees, we know about hummingbirds, even animals can be pollinators too, because pollen gets literally everywhere, especially in the spring. So this is a picture of a flower, and we're actually going to go over all of these like labels individually and identify parts of the flower. So flowers have male parts. Male as in they're the ones producing the sperm-related material, okay? So the stamen is the male reproductive organ, and it has two parts. The first part is the pollen sac or the anther. So it's this little thing that's at the top, this little package at the top of the stamen, and it contains pollen on top of it. The second part is a filament, and the whole job of the filament is for support. And so you see this long, thin strand. It's almost like a hair, and almost in every single flower, it's a really, really thin strand, which is why it's called a filament, because a filament literally means strand. Okay. So the filament holds the anther in position. It holds it higher up so that when pollinators are brushing against the flower, they're more likely to actually come in contact with the anther, and then they're going to brush off some pollen to take to another flower when they go to another flower for gathering nectar. Okay, so basically, these are the male parts of the flower, and usually there are multiple. Just because the more pollen a flower can produce, the more likely its DNA can be brought to another flower where it can then turn into seeds and turn into babies. The female part of the flower is the pistil, okay? It sounds like the gun pistol, but it's actually spelled differently. There's no O, okay? So there's three parts to the female part of a flower. The first one is the stigma. So the stigma is located at the top and is connected to the style. Okay, so a hint for remembering it is the sticky stigma because it's at the top where the pollen will touch and stick to it. So if we look at this diagram, in the middle here, you actually see the female part, and the stigma is this very, very top little knob of the pistil, and it's where the pollen will float in and land, or be brought in by a pollinator and land, and it will stick right onto here. The next part is the style. The style is the shaft connecting the stigma to the bottom where the ovary is. So again, the style is literally just a spacing material. And you see this whole thing right here, it's labeled as the style. So the stigma at the top is attached to the style, and the style is attached to the ovary at the bottom. So the ovary is the last part of the pistil, and it contains the eggs or ovules at the base. So it's at the very bottom of the female part of the flower, which is the pistil. And inside of it, you can see ovules or eggs. It's generally shaped like a bowling pin. They're talking about the pistil, and it's located in the center of the flower. So no matter what flower you look at, in the center is going to be the female part, the pistil, and there's only one of them. There's multiple male parts surrounding the pistil usually, but there's only one singular pistil in the center. If the egg does get fertilized, the ovule will develop into a seed. So this ovule inside of here will become a seed, and this ovary is going to become a fruit. Other parts of a flower. So sepals are small green leaf-like structures located at the base of a flower, and they protect the flower bud. They keep them together, they keep them upright, they keep them standing up. So these at the bottom here are the sepals, and they kind of look like mini leaves, and you'll be like, why are there leaves on this flower? But it's actually the sepal. It has its own special name. Petals are the highly colored parts of a flower that make them stand out to pollinators. So a lot of pollinators actually can't see the same color range that we do. They see different shades of colors, and some of them are missing complete colors, right? Because we can see Roy G. Biv, so we see all of the colors of the rainbow. But for example, like bees, they really only see in blues and yellows. So flowers that are bright yellow tend to stand out more to them than other flowers. So the brighter the petals of a flower, the more attractive they are to a pollinator to go and land on them, to then get nectar and brush off the pollen to bring to another flower. Interesting facts. So while most flowers contain both the anther and the pistil, right? Most flowers contain male and female parts at the same time. Some plants actually have different sexes. So cedar trees, right? A lot of people in Texas have cedar allergies because in the winter, cedar trees tend to let go of their pollen, and then that pollen goes everywhere and you can see it, and it's all over the roads, and people are just allergic to it. And so cedar trees actually have trees that are entirely male and entirely female. So the flowers on the male trees only have anthers. So they have that filament, and then, they only have, I should actually get this correct. They only have stamen in their center, right? And they produce pollen. So they have a bunch of filaments, and on top of those are the little packets of pollen called anthers, but there's no pistil in the center, right? So their only job is to produce pollen. They can't actually become fruits. And then some trees are only female. So the flowers on the female tree have no anthers, but only have that single pistil in the center. And they're the ones that actually produce fruit. Okay, cedar are a wintergreen tree though, so they're not producing a fruit like an apple like you would think. They're more producing like a nut or like a pine cone kind of fruit that has their seeds in it and can get dispersed somewhere else so that they can go into the ground and grow. So female trees don't produce any pollen. They only receive the pollen from the male trees. And this pollen is the stuff that's floating around everywhere and making everybody allergic. And those are literally packets of plant sperm. So pollination and fertilization. When pollination occurs, pollen moves from the male part to the female part, okay? Usually it's not on the same flower. Usually it's across different flowers, and especially if the flowers are separated by sexes, then it has to go from a male flower on a male plant to a female flower on a female plant. When the pollen grain lands on the stigma at the very, very top, a tiny tube grows out from it, down the style, and into the ovary at the bottom, where the ovules are and the seeds are, okay? When this pollen and the sperm packets that travel down this tube reach the ovule, then the fertilized ovule becomes the seed and the ovary will ripen into the fruit. Examples of fruits that we have, maybe ones that you mentioned before that you said you like to eat: watermelon, bananas, cucumbers, tomatoes, pumpkins, right? We know that for us, bananas and watermelons don't really have seeds, but that's because we genetically engineered them to be like that because we didn't like eating seeds as people. But in nature, if you grew a watermelon in naturally or a banana naturally, they're full of seeds. Seeds. So the outer covering of a seed is called a seed coat, right? It's like a jacket, a coat you wear to protect yourself. So seed coats help protect the embryo from injury and also from drying out. Some are thin and soft, like beans, or thick and hard, as in like locust or coconut seeds, right? Coconut shells, those things are tough. It's hard to get into them. The endosperm is a temporary food supply. So if you ever look at a bean and you split it into half, most of that is actually just endosperm, right? That is actually going to become food that the seed is going to eat. The seed is this tiny little hanging on the corner of the bean when you split it apart, okay? So it's packed around the embryo, so the embryo's first food source is already in the package with it, and it doesn't have to make sure that it has to get dirt or soil and has to grow roots. It already has its first meal prepackaged. So plants that have one cotyledon, so you can't actually split them in half, right? They're just one piece. For example, like corn, right? Corn, you can squeeze out the little seed, but actually the whole rest of the kernel can't be split in half. And that means it is a monocot because mono means one. Okay? Dicots are plants that have two cotyledons. So the example I keep going back to is beans, right? When you take a bean, you can actually split it in half evenly. It's already pre-split. That means it's a dicot because di means two, because there's two cotyledons, or there's two sections of the endosperm. Right, so for an example, here's a picture of a bean. Right here's the actual embryo. So the actual seed and the baby is right here. And all of this is the cotyledon. Okay, this is all food. It has no other purpose other than to be the first food source for this embryo or for this baby. And you can see on the outside layer, there's a seed coat. So when you have beans and you boil them enough or you cook them enough, you can actually see the seed coat peeling off. And it's like kind of clearish because it's a soft seed coat. But obviously, if you're talking about like pistachios or you're talking about coconuts, that seed coat is the toughest thing. Germination. So seeds remain dormant or inactive until conditions are right for germination. So they're not going to start sprouting unless all of these things are there. And so all they actually need are to have some water, some oxygen, the temperature can't be too cold, and then having a little light is helpful to tell them which way to grow, but it's not absolutely necessary because usually seeds are buried underground, right? So when they have all of these, they will germinate or grow from the seed and start sprouting into a plant. There are some plants that actually don't make flowers. And so non-flowering plants are like ferns. They're like these long strands that have a lot of little leaves going sideways. And they're not really a tree, but they're a lot taller than grasses. And they don't produce flowers. So they produce seed-like structures called spores. Now, these are not seeds. Don't get them mixed up. They begin with an S, but they are not seeds. These spores are found on the bottom side of the leaves, and they're growing in little patches, and they look like little fuzzy velvet pieces. Okay, when they're ripe, they fall off the leaf super, super easily, and then they can get brushed onto animal fur or onto the feathers of birds, and then they get dropped off randomly into another place where then they can sprout and grow. So that's it for this Edpuzzle. Make sure that afterwards you go and work on your interactive notebook section, and then there is an exit ticket to follow up and finish up today's class.